Right, so today, to wrap up our talk about European imperialism both in Africa and Asia, we're going to focus on Asia. So in terms of European imperialism in Asia, between 1750 and 1900, so around the same time that they are going over and conquesting Africa, they're also conquesting in Asia as well. And it's tied to some of the same things. Industrialized European nations wanted to expand aggressively, both for new markets and for new materials. They targeted these lands for those materials, for cheap labor, for strategic ports where they could both transport their goods and also sell those goods. So, in terms of why, once again, there's the economic motivations that I talked about in terms of needing raw materials, needing new markets. They also wanted to enrich the mother country in terms of these particular colonies. The industrialization is giving Europeans superior transportation and weaponry to other parts of the world as well that have not industrialized yet. You also have political and national rivalries that are taking place. So countries are competing in order to prove their own national greatness or nationalism. And then religious and moral justifications like we saw in Africa, where they are using the claim that they are civilizing non-Western cultures, even though some of these cultures are some of the most civilized and advanced in the world. They wanted to, prove that point or show that point from a moral perspective. In terms of how they conquested, some of these are going to look similar. One particular term that we've talked about somewhat, but we have not said in these direct terms, is gunboat diplomacy, not gunboat. Gunboat diplomacy. So powerful steam-powered warships would threaten these coastal cities and basically use these gunboats as a way to say, hey, either you do what I want or there's going to be severe consequences. And so the threat of military force was used to coerce people into doing what they wanted. But unlike some of the movements within, or the imperialism within Africa, you also have additional companies like the British East India Company that begin as merchants but become so powerful that they even have their own private armies that are able to command large amounts of power within these countries. You also have unequal diplomacy, so treaties that were forced on Asian nations, after military defeat, exploiting local divisions like we saw within Africa, and then superior weaponry as well. Hold on to control. So some of it is administrative. So creating these colonial bureaucracies that Europeans control top government jobs and locals are being excluded as well. Communication and transportation was huge as well. So railroads, telegraphs, steamships. Dividing and ruling, where they are picking one ethnic group over another as well. And then education policies that, again, are teaching these Western values to shape loyal subjects. And finally, legal systems that use European laws and replace traditional justice. So in terms of the treatment of local populations, in terms of thinking about how racism was used, Europeans believed that they were superior, and they used ideas like social Darwinism, which we talked about the other day, in order to, make claims as to why they were coming and taking over these places. And they also excluded locals under this basis from having any power within society as well. There's also forced labor and heavy taxation that's going on. There is violence against locals as well, like we saw in Africa. And then cultural suppression, like taking away traditional practices, religions, languages that are discouraged, as well as economic exploitation as well. So in terms of one case study within this, we can look to how the British ruled in India. So India's ethnic and religious diversity made it sort of vulnerable to European manipulation because there's a lot of different groups who want different things within India. And so the British used this in order to sort of play groups against each other. The British East India Company began in 1600 as a trade company. They would facilitate trade. They were economic in nature. But they built their own private army of these soldiers known as sepoys. And these were Indian soldiers that were fighting for the Europeans for pay. The East India Company ended up helping to defeat rival Indian rulers throughout India to slowly take over more and more of the country. And India became important because it provided goods like cotton or jute or opium, which is a drug that we're going to talk about later, or tea. However, there were still cultural divisions as they began to take over the British. And one such instance happened in 1857 with the Sepoy Rebellion. So the immediate cause was that there was a rumor that the new rifle cartridges were greased with cow and pig fat. And the cow especially is a holy animal within Hinduism, but also cow and pig fat would not be desirable things to handle and are against the religious rules within Hinduism and Islam. And so the Sepoys refused to use these new weapons. And so a mutiny broke out across northern India. However, there had already been growing resentment against the British for the disrespect to Indian cultural practices, taxes, and land policies as well. And so the outcome of this was that the British were able to end up putting down the rebellion. They were able to suppress it, and executions came out of this against many of the Sepoy. And so the British, in the aftermath of this, ended up ending the East India Company's rule and took direct control. And so what they created instead was the British form of government known as the British Raj. And this would last until 1947. So in terms of looking at the economic consequences in India of imperialism, for one, you had deindustrialization. So traditional hand-woven textile industries were collapsing and replaced by cheap British factory cloth that was mass-produced over and over again and wasn't as artistic. You also have cash crops, where farmers are now forced not to grow food, but grow things like opium, again a drug, cotton, made in clothes, and indigo, used to dye clothes, instead of food. And all of this led to famine as well, where people could not eat. The infrastructure, the British did build over 25,000 miles of railway, but this was often done to extract goods, to take these goods and to steal them away. And India also became a major market for British products and a supplier of raw materials. Now, another place that we want to think about is also China. So before imperialism and during the Qing dynasty, China viewed itself as a middle kingdom, meaning it was the cultural center of the world. It was in the middle of it all. China had a long history of prosperity. They had a lot of advanced technologies, including the creation of gunpowder, which would be used against them later on, and a stable government, which made many officials felt like they didn't need foreign goods. And so the Chinese government tightly controlled trade. They did not want foreigners to come in, and they did this through the Canton system, or the Canton system, excuse me. And this limited Europeans to the port of Canton in Guangzhou and required trade through licensed merchants. The Chinese would sell tea and silk and porcelain and spices, which were luxury goods in Europe, and the Chinese were making a lot of money off of this. However, the Europeans had little that the Chinese wanted in return, and so they had to pay for everything using silver, and this became quite costly for the Europeans. And so in order to gain more access to more ports and to make more money, they decided to clash with Chinese leaders, and slowly Europeans began to gain more and more influence within China. And so out of this came the Opium Wars. So to solve the silver shortage, which they're having to pay for all of the silver and to force more trade, Britain began doing something very dastardly. They began smuggling a highly addictive drug known as opium into the country. This was grown in India and smuggled into China. And so millions of Chinese people became addicted to this drug. This led to a weakening in military discipline, a declining worker productivity, a growing crime rate, and a massive flux of silver, which was used to pay for these drugs, out of China. And so over time, the Chinese government does not want this to continue because it's hurting their citizens. And so in order to do that, they decided to, the Chinese destroyed 20,000 chests of opium. And the British responded by firing upon the Chinese. They used their industrial era weapons, steam-powered iron ships, their cannons, their rifles, in order to batter the Chinese coasts. And China, at this point, weakened by poor leadership and internal rebellions, ended up suffering major defeats on the land and sea, and they couldn't keep up with the British militarily. And so the First Opium War ends with the Treaty of Nanjing, and this was often called the First Unequal Treaty because all of it benefited the British. Then we have a second Opium War that led to China losing again, and to even more ports, a legalization of opium, and allowing Christian missionaries within the country. And so all of this became a century of humiliation for China. Looking at the Treaty of Nanjing, we can see here that the following outcomes come out of sort of the excerpt that you see above. So for one, the Chinese had to pay money for the cost of the war, even though they are not the ones who started it. You also have the cession of territory. So they had to give away territory to the British, including Hong Kong, a major port, which became British until 1997 when it was given back to the Chinese. And then extra territoriality. And so within this, British citizens were tried under British law if they broke the rules within China and not Chinese law. And so this removed power from the Chinese. And so again, this sort of really damaged Chinese independence because of these things. So these unequal treaties would continue. After Britain has success, France, Russia, Japan, Germany, even the United States all want a piece of the pie. They demanded similar rights within this place, within China. And so these foreign nations controlled trade in certain coastal regions, known as spheres of influence. And these spheres of influence were how China was sort of broken apart. And so this is more of an economic takeover and not a more political takeover, but there's so much influence going on from these foreign areas and controlling different portions of trade that Chinese officials are losing control over their country. And so the national humiliation of having all of these foreigners come in and dominate this country is growing, especially for scholars and peasants who are not necessarily jiving with the traditions of these new places. And so Chinese responses, one, you have Lin Zexu's letter in 1839, and this was a moral and legal argument condemning Britain for spreading addictive drugs. You also have the self-strengthening movement of the 60s through the 90s, so trying to bring back Confucian tradition, trying to ward off, how these outside influences were trying to take things away from China, and also you have the Boxer Rebellion in 1900. So this is a secret society that attacked foreigners and Chinese Christians and tried to get these outside influences out of here. And this ended up being crushed by an international coalition. So many countries joining up and putting down this rebellion. And so in the end, because of things like the Boxer Rebellion, China was forced to pay even more fines and to allow more foreign troops in, and even further weakening the dynasty. So looking at the social, political, and economic consequences from throughout Asia. For one, socially, there's a loss of cultural confidence. There was a rise of Western educated reformers who were coming in as well and spreading Western ideas about how to live. There was a spread of Christianity in some regions as well. You also had traditional governments that were weakened, European advisors influencing law and tax policies, as well as nationalist movements that are emerging as well. And then finally, economically, you have colonies forced to export raw materials, losing resources, growth of cash crop economies that are there not to eat, but to be sold back to the other country and not being able to feed people within that country, within the colony. And then wealth again flowing back into Europe rather than staying in Asia, excuse me. So in terms of the legacy, borders changing, legal systems changing, economic patterns changing, it all is still somewhere in the formula for Asia today. And that imperial influence is still evident at times today. But you also had nationalist and independence movements that grew out of this, and this shaped those modern nations. So China turning towards communism is in part a response to the imperialism that had happened, that again they were able to shut foreigners out of their country, at least again for a while. And then a deep resentment towards foreign domination, and this is going to impact foreign policy for decades in terms of moving far away from the West as well. All right, if you have any questions over imperialism in Asia, please let me know. And other than that, have a great day.